Were you taken by surprise by your human milk feeding experience? This week's guest is able to express what so many of us feel when human milk feeding does not go exactly as we hoped. Elena gave birth to twins, and in talking to all the moms she knew before she gave birth, it seemed like breastfeeding would just come naturally. So it took her by surprise when she struggled with supply, especially when one of her twins was smaller than the other and had a more difficult time efficiently transferring milk. Elena gives such thoughtful reflections on what she would do differently if she had it to do all over again. Listen to this powerful story of twin feeding in Malaysia and how essentially becoming a mother really changed the way that Elena thinks about her whole life and what she is doing about that to make an impact on the world. When I began breastfeeding, I was blindsided by how difficult it was. I may have thought I was prepared, but having known only a handful of people who had ever breastfed and only seeing it up close from a couple of them, I had a huge learning curve. Since then, I've become a doula, a lactation consultant, and a childbirth educator. I'm your host, Lo Nigrosh, and I welcome you to the Milk Making Minutes, where we explore breastfeeding experiences through the lens of systemic barriers, so that you know your breastfeeding struggles are not your fault, and your triumphs really are the miracles you feel they are. Hi, Elena. Welcome to the Milk Making Minutes. I'm so glad you're here.
Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Me too. So before we get into your personal baby feeding stories, tell me a little bit about yourself and your family.
So I live in Malaysia with my husband and two 6-year-old twin boys. Yeah, we've lived here for the last 12 years. And it was a shock when we were having twins.
Yeah, I bet. What brought you to Malaysia in the first place?
So I'm half Malaysian. So this
Okay.
is home for me in some ways. My parents were living here at the time. I came here for a job. I planned to stay only a year. It was a 1-year contract, but 13 years later, I'm still here. I met my husband not long after I arrived here. So that's probably one of the reasons why I've stayed.
Yes, that makes sense. So I want to take you back to long before you were planning your family and finding out that you were expecting twins, to your childhood.
Mm-hmm.
And I want you to think about what your exposures to baby feeding were, and specifically if you have any memories of people feeding babies from their bodies as a child.
I don't think I have a single memory of watching somebody breastfeed when I was young. I know my mother didn't. Neither my sister or I were breastfed. My mother's breastfeeding journey was extremely traumatic because she had very poor support and advice. She and my father were living in a foreign country, so she didn't have access to family and she didn't have a lot of good support. And her experience with my elder sister meant that when it came time to have me and time to feed me, she didn't even want to attempt breastfeeding.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't remember seeing women breastfeed growing up.
Yeah. And did your mom's experiences impact how she talked to you about what your plans were?
She was always extremely supportive of whatever choice I wanted to make.
That's amazing.
But she also said, if you struggle or if it's not working for you in the way you intend, there's nothing wrong with feeding your baby formula. So that was always her message. Yeah.
So she struck that balance of supporting what your wishes were, but also being a voice of reason at a time when sometimes we can't find the reason within our own brains. Speaking of your own brain, whether you are trying to calm the monkey brain during a time of conception, while you are pregnant, or during breastfeeding or pumping, The Meditation Mama podcast has meditations designed for you. The founder, Kelly Smith, was my guest on episode 95 when she shared her own exclusive pumping story. If you are in need of some meditations for your motherhood journey, these are accessible no matter how much meditation you have done. Find them on Amazon Music, Good Pods, or wherever you are listening to this podcast right now.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. And so as you became pregnant and then you start to kind of view the world a little bit differently, I think, in your pregnancy, and you start to look around at other pregnant people and you start to look around at people with babies and people with kids. You were in Malaysia at the time, right?
Yeah.
And had you grown up in Malaysia or did you grow up somewhere else?
Not in Malaysia, but we lived in other parts of Southeast Asia growing up. So I was born in Thailand, and we lived in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in Singapore. But we used to come back to Malaysia often because my grandparents lived here and we had a lot of extended family here. So it didn't feel like an unfamiliar place. In fact, I felt really happy that we were here because the healthcare, particularly the private healthcare, is really great. And I was heavily monitored, not just because I was having twins, but because in general in Malaysia, you receive a lot of scans. Almost at every appointment, you will have a sonogram. So for me, I felt like I had really good access to healthcare. I had a lot of monitoring, and that anything I might need if things were to go wrong would be available.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes. You liked that idea of having that heavy monitoring.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. For
I
some
realized
people, that makes them more anxious, and for other people, that makes them less anxious. And so it's great that you were in an environment where you felt less anxious by that medical system.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as you looked around you and you were seeing the world through these eyes of somebody who's about to welcome a baby into the world, did you notice anything about the culture of baby feeding as a pregnant person? Did you see anybody breastfeeding? Did you notice mostly bottles? What did you notice?
So at the time that I was pregnant, I had a small group of friends that already had children, but they were probably not my closest friends at the time. And all of them had breastfed, and all of them were breastfeeding relatively easily. My sister as well had her daughter a couple of years before me, and she breastfed really easily. She produced huge amounts of milk. So all around me were women successfully breastfeeding with ease. So I assumed that I would be able to also.
And were you connected with other twin families?
Not when I was pregnant. I then met some other twin moms shortly after I gave birth.
Okay. And did you have providers talking to you about your baby feeding options and about what feeding twins might look like once it happened? Any prenatal education around breastfeeding twins?
I had a little bit. That was the one thing that I think was a little bit lacking. From a strictly medical perspective, there was a lot of support, but in terms of education, like I didn't attend any prenatal classes. There weren't prenatal groups in the way that friends back in New Zealand or in the UK had access to. So I didn't really have that education. I just read books. I talked to my friends who had kids, and I bought a lot of equipment. I bought a breastfeeding pillow. I bought a breast pump. Yeah, I assumed I would need those things. I assumed that I would be able to tandem feed my twins.
Okay, so dun dun dun, that sets us up for what might have happened. So, knowing that this isn't really a birth podcast, and also knowing that birth often impacts what happens with feeding, do you want to talk a little bit about, in your mind, what happened in the birth that might have impacted, particularly those first breastfeeding moments, and then how that could have impacted breastfeeding as you continued?
So I think the biggest thing was I was diagnosed with twin-to-twin transfusion syndrome. But thankfully, this occurred late in my pregnancy. So by the time it was spotted, we decided we would monitor it for a couple of weeks, see if anything happened naturally. Nothing did. So at 36 weeks, I delivered by cesarean, which was something I was prepared for. I knew because of the position of the babies and because I hadn't gone into labor. I knew, and because of the twin to twin transfusion syndrome, I knew that a cesarean was going to be a high possibility and I was prepared for it. And that part of it was fine. But it did mean that one of my boys, Finn, was significantly smaller than his brother. And that affected his ability to not to latch so much, but to transfer milk. He would suckle for ages and then I would weigh him afterwards and it seemed like he'd hardly taken anything. So I guess that stress when you, after they come out and you see these babies for the first time and you see how tiny they are, particularly Finn, how tiny he was. I remember the way his skin looked on his body. It was almost like his skin was wrinkly. It was like he was wearing a onesie that was too big for him. And feeding Finn became stressful because I felt like the stakes were higher.
Of course you would. Yeah. Yeah. He was 36 weeks. He was a twin and he was a smaller twin. Do you remember his weight at birth offhand?
Yeah. So he was 1.8 kilograms. I'm not sure what that would be in pounds.
3.96 pounds. Yeah. And so were they in the NICU?
Thankfully, no. They didn't need to go into NICU. They were small, but they were very healthy. They didn't have any breathing problems. Sam, my husband, immediately was able to go into the nursery with both of them and do skin to skin with both of them until I was ready to come up. And then we could do that in our room. And yeah, so we were lucky. We had assumed because of their predicted sizes that they would need some NICU time, but they didn't. Finn is a fighter to this day.
Amazing. Yeah, it's amazing. And also, it could be a little anxiety inducing to realize, oh my goodness, we're the people who have to care for these tiny babies.
Yeah, I remember they wanted me to leave the hospital because they were expecting a lot of women were coming in to deliver babies and they wanted me to leave because they wanted my room. This was after 4 days, I think. And I said, no, sorry, I'm paying for this room and I'm staying. And they're like, okay, that's fine, but you won't be able to access the nurses as frequently as you have been, which probably tells you how much support I needed at the time. But I was like, no, please just let me stay one more night. And yeah.
Of course. Yeah. So what kind of supports were they offering you in those first 4 days in particular that helped you feel like you were able to manage feeding these babies that were so small, in particular Finn, who was really small?
I did have access to a lactation consultant. So she taught me how to breastfeed because I had no idea what to do. I thought that it would be natural that you'd put this baby on your breast and something would happen, but it wasn't. Trying to get both of them to latch, understanding what it feels like when your milk is letting down, because if you've never felt like that, how do you know? And also what it feels like when your breast is empty. So all of these things she taught me. And then the nurses were helpful in trying to assess whether or not the boys they would weigh them before and after feed so that I could gauge about how much they had taken. And they were also helpful in trying to get a pumping schedule on and just teaching me all of the things that I needed to know, like how to clean them and how to take care of their umbilical cord and all of these things and what I should eat. I have to say in Asia, there is a heavier focus on the mother postpartum and the mother's care. So they were also very focused on me and what I should be eating and what I should be doing and how much sleep I should be getting.
Yeah. Yeah. I just had a guest from India actually a couple of episodes ago, and she talked about both her parents and her in-laws coming and the amount of postpartum care that was focused on her
Yeah.
and how she can't imagine how many people just go without that.
Yeah.
How do you do it? And I'm like, yeah, I know. How do we do it?
Yeah, I think even in the West, there was a time when we probably did it that way as well, when
Of
women would
course.
come together and support each other
Yes,
post-birth, but something's changed in more recent history.
exactly. Right.
Yeah, the thing that I find interesting is that before I gave birth, when I spoke to other mothers, even mothers who were friends or my sister, and even my mom to an extent, like I knew my mother had challenges, but I feel like a lot of the challenges that I faced postpartum were not really being talked about. And then when I brought them up postpartum and I was asking like, and how do you know what it feels like? How do you know that your breast is empty? Or how are you managing to produce this much milk? Or is it normal that I feel overwhelmed and anxious all the time? Is it normal that I'm having all of these feelings? And they all said yes, but nobody told me to expect it beforehand.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. It's like it's something I hear so many people talking about, yet we all feel so blindsided by it. I'll hear people say, nobody talks about this. And maybe it's because I'm in this insular world of the birth world. I was a doula, I'm a birth worker. So I'm amongst people who talk about it a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. I feel like we're talking about it, but we're missing the mark somehow.
Yeah.
Because you're right. Like we all feel blindsided by it, but how do we talk about it in a way that's not fear mongering, but also helps prepare people for what is to come? But maybe it's less about talking about it and creating systems that are truly just supportive so that people don't feel that way.
Yeah.
you know? Yeah.
Yeah. It's almost like when you become a mother, only then you enter the club and people feel comfortable to talk to you about it. But before then, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard because when somebody's pregnant and they're excited about their baby coming, and, when somebody says they're tired because they're pregnant and then somebody else says, "Well, just wait till the baby comes," you
Mm.
feel really annoyed with that person, right?
Yeah.
You're like, "Why are you telling me that? I'm tired now. Don't try to dismiss my feelings of being tired because your feelings of having a newborn are worse."
Yeah.
Like, so it's really hard to try to
Yeah.
strike that balance. So, going back to being in the hospital and having that lactation consultant help you, did she help you figure out how to manage a schedule? Because you said you had this idea of tandem feeding, but I've heard from a
Mm-hmm.
lot of twin moms, and as I've helped twin moms in my own private practice, usually, in my experience, I've seen that it takes kind of a while to get to tandem feeding, if ever. And
Mm-hmm.
some people actually recognize, oh, I've got to learn how to feed each baby individually. I have to get comfortable with feeding for a while first. And then over time, I might begin to do some tandem feeding. And so, did she help you kind of manage figuring that out? In addition to, you said you started pumping right away. So, were you trying to figure out that schedule?
Yeah. So she did encourage me to treat both of them as different little humans from the beginning and to expect that it would be a different feeding journey with each of them. So we did start working on how to feed each one individually. I started pumping right away because I wanted to try and the the nurses in the hospital, and some of this stuff is a blur now, but the nurses in the hospital wanted to make sure that I got as much of the colostrum as I could out. And at first they were trying to like I was manually pumping it and syringing it off my breast. And then we started doing that with the breast pump because they wanted to make sure that if breastfeeding took a while to get established, and because Finn was so small and they didn't want him to lose more than 10% of his weight, that they could feed him the colostrum regardless. And they did that using a cup. So the goal was to make sure that the babies were being fed while I got breastfeeding established.
Okay. I don't know if I'm picking up on this correctly or not, but you have a sound of kind of doubt, or was that not what you were wanting to happen, and it felt like that you were like on this train that you were riding that the nurses were running, or you, in hindsight, what did you think about this plan?
At the time, I just wanted my babies to be fed, and I had no idea how to do it. I was also at a baby-friendly hospital, so they do not encourage formula feeding in those early days while you're still in hospital. So I guess the hesitancy is coming partly because a lot of those early days are a blur now in hindsight, but also because just nothing about it, nothing about the experience was what I expected. And so
Mm-hmm.
I felt in many ways I was doing what I was told.
Right. So it might have been better if they said, here are your options. You can hand express colostrum onto a spoon or into a syringe. These are the benefits of colostrum for your really tiny baby. Or you can feed formula if you're feeling really worried. And here's how we would make a plan to feed formula and also establish your milk supply. And this is what formula feeding would look like. And this is how you could do it. And, like, would that have felt more like, okay, these are my options. Let me think about what I would like to do given this situation?
Yeah, no one ever had that conversation with me.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody, even when I was pregnant, asked what I planned to do about feeding.
Mm. Okay, real quick. Are you listening to this and thinking, oh my gosh, I might need some help figuring out what my baby feeding plan is, and you're pregnant? Or have you already had your baby and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I really need a lactation consultant to be a sounding board, and I really need somebody who's not going to judge me, who's really going to listen to me? Well, I would love to be the person who's on your side and who's really going to help you figure out what your next right steps are given your unique set of circumstances. So if it sounds like I might be a right fit for you, go ahead and go to my website. That will be the first place to start. You can see if your insurance will cover visits with me. You can find out more at www.quavinbirthservices.com. I can't wait to talk to you.
It sounds incredibly naive in hindsight, but I honestly believed that I would put these babies on my breast and my body or myself intuitively would know what to do. That is honestly what I believed.
That's not naive at all. I mean, we're mammals. We have breasts. Milk comes out of them, and you had known all these people who had breastfed successfully without issue, to your knowledge,
Yeah. And then in hindsight, after I'd said I had these problems, and they're like, oh, yeah, that happened to me too. And then I was
Right.
like,
It
so
would have
now,
been nice to know
it would have been
that.
nice to know. So now I try very hard whenever my friends are pregnant to ask, what are you going to do about feeding? And this was my experience. And I always try and just say it in those ways. This was my experience because everybody's experience is completely different. And I
Exactly.
don't want anything to come across as judgmental or recommending a certain
Mm-hmm.
method.
Right. Yeah, it's a fine balance between what happened to me is definitely going to happen to you, and I want you to know and experience so that you can be prepared for what could happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's important for providers to hear that people need to have choices. If you just come into a room and start squeezing somebody's breast and sucking it up with a syringe, like, that might not be what the person wants. You have to give people a moment, and this is their body and their babies. Ultimately, they're the person who gets to make the decision. Um, And, we have all this knowledge in our heads about long-term, blah, 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 and impacts of formula, long-term. But also, you just have to put that aside and look at each patient as an individual person who's just trying to make the next right decision.
Mm. I like
And
that. The
can,
next right decision.
Yeah. And there's never a time when a decision that is made in this moment has to be the final decision forevermore. So then you got the extra day in the hospital, the day 5.
The day 5. I got day 5.
Yeah.
And then they were like, we really need this room now. You'll be fine.
You'll be fine with your 2 small babies who really aren't transferring tons of milk yet. And we haven't mentioned anything about formula.
No, we haven't. No, they can't. They can't.
Well, I must say, I have to understand baby friendly. I am WHO compliant. And it's not that you can't mention it. Different hospitals take this to different extremes.
Mm-hmm.
You can mention formula. You have to buy the formula.
Okay.
From the distributors. So you can't take tons of free samples and then give those out. If you are going to distribute formula, because lots of babies need formula supplementation in the hospital, some parents choose not to even start breastfeeding. And so the requirement for baby friendly hospital means that the hospitals cannot accept any free milk substitutes. Yeah, they just have to buy it at market price in order to distribute it to their families. So they might have chosen not to buy any. I don't know.
They certainly didn't. There was a pharmacy in the hospital which did sell formula. I remember seeing that.
Okay, so maybe you would have had to go and buy it yourself.
Yeah. But then the breastfeeding consultant from the hospital, she then came, I think for a month. The first month she came to visit me. That was an additional service that we had to purchase, but she came and visited for the first 2 weeks. I think it was every day. And then thereafter she would come a couple of times a week. And she was a godsend. I wouldn't have been able to do it without her.
Of course not. Yeah. I can't imagine so. Yeah. And so was she bringing a scale and doing weighted feeds and helping you get set up in your home environment? And
yeah, all of those things. She was explaining how to bath the babies. I didn't even know things like that you shouldn't use any kind of soap for the first, I can't remember, a month, maybe more. You should just bathe them with water and clean off, anything gently. She taught us what to look for in their poops, what was normal and what was not normal. She helped us get a sleep schedule in place and a feeding schedule in place. And she taught me about different things that helped with milk production. But to be honest, the only thing that worked for me was lots of water and lots of sleep. And unfortunately, sleep was the one thing I wasn't getting a lot of. But I definitely noticed the difference. If I had a good night, I had so much more milk the next day.
Interesting. Yeah. I fed babies for over 9 years and I never got any sleep.
Yeah. I tried everything, like various teas and oats and Alex, which is it's like a malt drink, which is apparently supposed to work, but nothing really worked. Lots of fluids and rest.
Yeah. Yeah. These recommended galactagogues, which is what they're called. I'm always so fascinated to hear what people from different parts of the world get recommended because it varies culturally. There are some consistent recommendations. I'm so fascinated because just like the postpartum care routines vary to some degree from place to place, these foods that get recommended vary. And I'm so fascinated to hear what they are.
Yeah. She would bring me these cookies. They tasted good. I don't think they had any noticeable difference on my supply. I think the other thing about my supply is because Finn wasn't able to breastfeed on the breast as well as Patrick. I realize I haven't spoken about Patrick, but Patrick could. I think that also affected my supply because draining your breast through a pump and I think the hormones and the signals your body receives when there's actually a baby on there is different. So I feel that I assume that had I managed to breastfeed both of them on the breast, then maybe I would have had better supply.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Did she ever size you for your phalanges?
Oh, yes. Yeah. At first, I wasn't managing to get much milk out using the pump. So she came and brought a whole bunch of other phalanges and also different brands of pumps so that I
Mm-hmm.
could try and see what worked. And in the
Oh,
end,
good.
I did end up using a different one, the Medela Freestyle. I loved it. I loved
Oh,
that you could charge it and it would clip onto like the waistband of my trousers. So I could walk around the house just pumping, hands free.
yeah. Yeah. That is nice. Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad that worked for you. Yeah. So how long did you ever end up adding in any supplementation?
Yeah.
Okay. So at what point did you do that?
Towards the end of the first month, so at the end of week 3, I started having to top up, but it would come in ebbs and in flows. So I would have some weeks where I needed to top up more than others, and then I would have some weeks where my supply was really good and I wouldn't
Hmm.
need to top up much at all.
And did you notice a pattern?
So
Um,
I wrote everything down, and just before we started recording, I was reading through my notebook because at the time I couldn't figure out what was making the difference. And even now, when I look at the notes, I can't see exactly what it might have been.
yeah, that's interesting.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah, milk supply can be a mysterious thing
Yeah.
sometimes. Yeah. And then how long did you end up feeding them breast milk?
6 months.
Mhm. Yeah.
I really wanted to get to a year, but in addition to having supply issues, I found it so exhausting
Mhm.
because I was doing this kind of crazy breastfeeding and pumping thing, which meant that I was attached to a baby or a pump most of the day. And yeah, I think if it had been I also feel like it was very regimented. And at the time, that was what I wanted because I wanted to be really sure that they were getting a certain amount of milk every day. But in hindsight, if I was to do it again, let's say, I think I would try and be a little bit more relaxed about the whole process.
Mhm.
I think I would try and have the babies in bed with me and
Mhm.
see if they would feed when they needed to feed. Bit difficult when you have two. I think I would have spent more time in bed rather than
Mhm.
trying to do tummy time with them or checking to see that they were meeting whatever other developmental milestones we were looking for at the time. I think I would have tried to relax and let other people help more because there were other people to help. At
Mhm.
that time, we had my parents, my mother came and stayed for a month. My aunt came for part of the time. We also had a nanny for part of the time. So I had support. If I had wanted to
Mhm.
stay in bed and just feed and sleep, I could have done that.
Mm. Yeah, that's an interesting reflection. Sometimes we have this idea that we have to be the super mom and we have to put on a good face for everybody and show that we're doing it all or just prove to ourselves. Maybe it's not about everybody else, but proving it to ourselves.
Yeah.
And that may have we can't know. We don't have a time machine and go back, but having that sort of attitude towards baby feeding may have had a different impact on your milk supply as you might have been less stressed, you might have been doing more skin to skin time, they might have had the opportunity to kind of snack more throughout the day, which would have had a better impact on your milk supply. But like we said at the beginning, you were doing the best you could with the knowledge you had and you were taking each right step that you knew at the time. And that's all any of us can do, you know?
Yeah.
And they all end up eating goldfish off the floor
Oh,
in the end.
this is the thing that I find so interesting. My boys are identical twins who have
Mhm.
always only been given the same foods. And
Mhm.
I was militant about making sure that they both had exactly the same amount of breast milk and formula. I didn't want there to be any discrepancy between what each of them was fed in that regard. And they have completely different food tastes. So this idea that if you wean with more vegetables and less fruit, or if you, I don't know, do anything that you will somehow influence your children's tastes down the line, I don't buy it. I think increasingly that kids are who they are from birth, and you can't mold them. They will just become.
Right. We can plant the seeds of influence and hope they pick some things up along the way. That's such an interesting bit of wisdom about your two identical twins.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up here, I don't know if there's anything else you want to mention about their feeding journeys.
Yeah. I think the only thing I would say is that I wish that I had been gentler on myself and kinder to myself and more accepting of the fact that if it didn't go the way I thought it would go, that was okay. And that to a certain extent, you can read everything you like and you can be as prepared as possible and at the same time be completely unprepared when it happens. And that's okay. That's part of the journey. And assuming that you have the basics in your life, have access to clean water and have access to medical care, you and your babies will be fine. Like, I wish someone had said that to me. You don't need to put all of this pressure on yourself. You and your babies will be fine.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah. Yeah. And I will add to that it's okay to grieve the lost experience of what you hoped
Yeah.
to have achieved. You know, human milk feeding, breastfeeding is a visceral experience for so many of us, not for everyone. You know, I talked to some people who are like, yeah, I'm going to try. And if it doesn't work out, great. And for many other people, including myself, it was like, no, I have to do this. And if it doesn't work out, I will be devastated. And we can't always explain why. And I don't think it's for me, it was not a social pressure. It was just this internal feeling of like, I really want to do this. You know,
Yeah.
I really want to do this. And, you know, like when it doesn't work out, it's okay to change the plan and it's okay to grieve.
Yeah.
You know, both are okay.
Yeah. Thank you for saying it's okay to grieve, because I think that is something that I still struggle with. I am still disappointed that it wasn't the experience that I thought it would be.
Yeah. 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 That can be so hard. Yeah. And you're 6 years out, but
Yeah.
you know, these baby feeding experiences, they're our entrance into motherhood, you know, and we have so many expectations about baby feeding. So I can understand why you would still be having feelings about that. And I talk to so many people who are, so it's a very normal experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing those experiences. As we wrap up, I just would love for you to share with my listeners about your show, The Purpose Effect.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity as well to share a little bit about The Purpose Effect. So The Purpose Effect is about women building impact businesses. And it started at a time during COVID where I think many of us were reevaluating a lot of the things that were happening in our lives. And I started thinking a lot about how ever since becoming a parent, I think I had found what I was doing professionally a little bit less fulfilling than how I had found it before. Everything changed. And I really felt that if you're not doing something, and it doesn't have to be a big thing, it can be just a small thing. If you're not doing something with your life that is trying to leave the world just a little bit better than what it was like when you found it, then what is the point of all of this? And so I wanted to understand and learn from women who had built businesses or were using their work to really create impact. I wanted to see if there was a common thread or something I could learn, or if there was a way that I could find direction for myself. And what I learned is that most of these women do not set out on their journeys looking for something in particular. Purpose is not the start of their journey. Purpose is the journey. It's something you discover with every step you take. And it's much more of a direction than a destination. And I think that that is really interesting when it comes to building the businesses or doing the work that's really going to solve some of the big problems that we face in the world. So, yeah.
Yeah, I love that. So most of these people come to their work, they find purpose and meaning because they have found something in particular that they want to change.
Yeah.
And that's what they focus on. And then through that, they find purpose and meaning for themselves.
Yeah.
Is that
yes.
what you have been finding?
So usually it's a problem that starts with a problem that they're either facing themselves or they can see somewhere else in the world that they want to solve. And then it becomes about, solving that in some small way. And sometimes
That's
big
amazing.
ways. Some of these women are solving really big problems. There's an episode that I did recently with a woman called Tracy Minok-Nuku. She is a menopause educator, and she is amazing. The things she is doing to improve healthcare education and fitness education in particular for women in midlife.
I just have to pop in and say I loved this episode of The Purpose Effect. As a 42-year-old woman who was vastly undereducated about my own body, about sexuality, about puberty, and of course about menopause, this episode gave me such great food for thought about the time of life I'm in. Think night sweats every single night. It even gave me the courage to ask my own mother about her menopause experience, and this is not the type of topics we normally discuss. So The Purpose Effect has so many inspiring episodes on such a wide range of topics because Elena interviews people who are solving problems that they are interested in, and they are finding purpose that way. All women. So if you are looking for purpose in your life, I highly recommend you check out her podcast. It's really amazing. All right. Well, thank you so much. I wish we could talk for so much longer.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And thank you for the space you're holding as well, because I think if I had access to some of the work you do and also some of the education that you do before I had my babies, that maybe I would have enjoyed the experience more.
Well, thank you. That's the goal.
Yeah.
Elena fed twins from her body for 6 whole months. And like for so many others, wishes that number were bigger, that the months were longer. She did everything she knew how to do, and feeding babies in this modern world is hard. And every person who takes each next right step for themselves and their families is doing a great thing. So let's hold each other up, celebrate what we have each accomplished, and also allow space for whatever feelings accompany the changed plans, be that relief, sadness, grief, surprise. If your baby feeding journey was different than your dreams and you still harbor feelings of grief, take a moment to feel that feeling. We see you, grief. Whether it's been a month or a decade, we know you made the best decision, and sometimes the best decision feels hard. Good moms feed their babies in so many different ways. Good parents feed their babies in different ways. If you are interested in understanding the intersection of baby feeding and mental health, join my Milk Making Minutes community group on Facebook. This is a growing group, a place where parents, doulas, mental health counselors, lactation professionals, peer counselors, all come together to create a space of open dialogue about the barriers that exist in human milk feeding and discuss how that impacts the parents trying to feed their babies. I'll see you there. Bye.